under the cold glare of first-class lighting. He hadn't even taken his seat before the judgment started. A black man in an expensive suit, and somehow, that alone was enough to make the flight attendant sneer, the passengers stare, and the entire cabin quietly decide he didn't belong. No one asked his name, no one questioned her tone. They just watched as she stripped away his dignity one procedure at a time, unaware that the man they dismissed was about to turn their world upside down. This isn't just a story about discrimination at 30,000 feet. It's about the moment justice walked in quietly, sat down in seat 1A, and waited. If this story stops you in your tracks, like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Have you ever seen someone treated this way just for who they are? And where are you watching from? Tell us below. We're reading everything. Let's begin. The airport was buzzing, a symphony of wheels rolling, boarding calls echoing through glass walls, and the faint scent of fresh leather and jet fuel lingering in the air. At Gate 1A, where only the most elite clientele boarded, the mood was quieter, almost reverent. Selim Rourke approached the velvet rope with a kind of ease that came from years of knowing his worth. His steel gray suit hugged his frame with tailored precision, offset by the muted shimmer of his deep navy tie. No jewelry, no flash, just presence. As he reached the front of the line, a handful of first-class passengers glanced at him with casual disinterest. But not Brielle Danton. The lead flight attendant that day, Brielle stood poised like a sentinel at the gate, her posture sharp, her smile selective. Her eyes scanned the boarding pass in Selim's hand, then immediately flicked upward to meet his. She didn't smile. Instead, her lips curled, just slightly, into something that might have been called a smirk if it weren't so restrained. "First class is getting more accessible every day, huh?" she muttered, not to him, but just loud enough for her fellow attendant to hear as she took the scanner from its dock. The scanner beeped, validating the ticket. "Mr. Rourke," she said flatly, without making eye contact again. She stepped aside with a practiced flick of her wrist, not inviting him in, but allowing him to pass, like a bouncer checking ID at a club he didn't think someone like him should be at. Selim's expression didn't change. He offered a polite nod, adjusted the strap of his leather bag, and stepped onto the boarding ramp. Inside the aircraft, the first-class cabin gleamed with polished wood accents, champagne-colored seating, and soft ambient lighting set to mimic the golden hour. Selim found his seat, 1A, as stated. He reached up to place his carry-on in the overhead bin. Just as his hand touched the handle, Brielle appeared at his side. "I'm going to need you to keep that with you," she said curtly. "We've closed the overhead compartments already." Selim blinked, then looked up at the compartment, which was wide open and empty. He glanced back at her, calm but confused. "The plane hasn't even finished boarding," he said, measured. "I was just about to, sir," she cut in, her tone now firm, professional but with an unmistakable edge. "Regulations require us to close overheads 10 minutes before final cabin prep. You'll need to keep your bag under the seat. I'm sure you'll manage." Before he could respond, she reached above his head and slammed the bin shut with unnecessary force. The thud echoed slightly, sharp against the otherwise hushed atmosphere of the cabin. Selim looked at her for a moment, as if debating whether to press the issue. He decided not to. With a quiet exhale, he shifted his carry-on to his lap. It was bulky, not enormous, but certainly not ideal for a multi-hour flight. His laptop and presentation materials were inside, not something you risk placing in the press of feet and drink trays. Still, he made no complaint. Brielle, satisfied, turned on her heel and strutted toward the galley, her walk brisk, her chin tilted slightly higher than necessary. A moment later, another passenger boarded, a white man in his 50s, dressed casually in linen and boat shoes. He stumbled slightly as he entered the cabin, wheeling a full-size roller bag behind him. "Oh, sorry," the man chuckled. "Bit late to the party, huh?" Brielle's entire demeanor changed. She smiled, a real one this time, and stepped forward to help. "Not a problem at all, Mr. Kemper," she beamed. "Let me help you with that." She opened the overhead bin 2 rows back, which was still empty, and gently lifted the man's suitcase in without a second thought. Selim watched this with quiet observation, his jaw tensing slightly, but still saying nothing. He leaned back in his seat, adjusting the weight of the bag on his lap, the leather digging lightly into his thighs. Around him, passengers trickled in, chatting softly, sipping on complimentary champagne. The disparity didn't escape him, but neither did it surprise him. Selim had experienced this brand of discrimination before. Not loud, not hostile, but precise, polished, packaged as policy. A form of exclusion hidden behind a smile, justified through protocol, reinforced by silence. He wasn't dressed wrong. He wasn't late. His seat wasn't in question. But to Brielle Danton, he still didn't fit. His phone buzzed. A message from his assistant, confirming the figures for tomorrow's investor meeting. He typed back quickly with one hand, the other resting on the briefcase still pinned between his knees. As he hit send, he glanced across the aisle and caught the eye of another passenger, a middle-aged woman in pearls and a cashmere shawl. She stared at him for a beat too long, then looked away without acknowledgement. Brielle returned once more, doing a slow sweep through the aisle, eyes darting over seat numbers and passengers. When she reached Selim again, her gaze paused briefly, not out of concern, more like confirmation. She didn't say anything, didn't offer water or a towel like she had to the others. Just moved on. It was going to be a long flight. Selim had been silent for most of the boarding, trying to center himself despite the weighted presence of the carry-on pressing into his lap. The memory of Brielle's smirk as she slammed the overhead shut replayed in his mind like a glitch. He could feel it wasn't just a one-off slight. It was going to be one of those flights, the kind where dignity erodes by the minute and injustice wears a uniform and a smile. As the plane began taxiing, he adjusted slightly in his seat, trying to ignore the faint strain in his back from the awkward posture. Just as he leaned to one side to shift the briefcase's weight, Brielle appeared once more, crouching beside him with the clipboard tucked tight under her arm, her expression now a carefully composed mask of concern. "Mr. Rourke," she said in a voice just loud enough for the nearby passengers to hear, "we're detecting a malfunction in the seat panel for 1A. It seems the recline function is stuck in the locked position, and for safety reasons, I'm going to have to move you." Selim blinked, confused. "It's fine," he replied, his voice calm but tight. "I don't need to recline. I'll be all right." But Brielle's lips twitched, not in empathy, but in challenge. "I'm afraid it's not optional. FAA regulations," she said crisply, standing tall, already gesturing for him to follow her. She didn't wait for his agreement, didn't ask if he had a preference, just walked. He stood slowly, the carry-on now heavier than before, following her down the aisle with every step echoing humiliation. She led him past rows of plush seats, away from the quiet hum of the front cabin, all the way to seat 7C, an aisle seat directly adjacent to the lavatory, crammed near the curtain that separated first class from premium economy. The seat was narrow, fixed, and smelled faintly of antiseptic and air freshener that failed to mask the scent of overuse. "We'll try to restore your original seat after takeoff," Brielle lied smoothly, handing him a cheap set of headphones instead of the Bose noise-canceling ones he had initially been provided. Selim said nothing. He sat, tucked his carry-on beneath the narrow leg space, and looked ahead, breathing evenly through his nose, the tightness in his chest barely contained. Passengers glanced at him as they passed, some curious, others indifferent. No one offered empathy. No one asked questions. The seat's screen flickered. The tray table was sticky. The air vent above him wouldn't close. None of this was catastrophic. None of it required a complaint. But it wasn't about the seat. It never had been. A young attendant rolled a cart down the aisle, smiling, serving pre-selected meals. The aroma of warm lemon chicken and seared salmon wafted through the air. Selim, who hadn't eaten since morning, adjusted his collar slightly, trying to distract himself. When the attendant reached his row, she paused, looked at her list, then shook her head politely. "Sorry, sir, this row wasn't included in the hot meal service," she said, lowering a tray of cold finger sandwiches onto his table. "It's airline policy for seat groups below row 5. He looked down at the bland arrangement of dry crackers and sliced cucumbers with a faint flicker of disbelief. But he said nothing. Not yet. He unfolded the napkin slowly, chewing each bite as if it weren't an insult dressed as a snack. His phone buzzed. It was a notification from his associate, reminding him of a pending document that needed to be signed before landing. Selim opened his laptop, connected to the onboard Wi-Fi portal, and attempted to enter the code listed on his ticket. It didn't work. He tried again. Still nothing. He flagged Brielle as she passed, this time with a genuine question. "Excuse me," he said, keeping his tone as neutral as possible. "The Wi-Fi code provided with my ticket isn't valid. Could you check if there's an updated one?" Brielle leaned in slightly, her smile thin as paper. "That code's reserved for our verified first-class guests, Mr. Rourke," she said with carefully measured precision. "It's possible the system hasn't fully updated your new seat. I'm afraid I can't authorize access from row 7. He held her gaze. "My seat was moved." I understand," she cut in smoothly. "But your current cabin class doesn't include premium access. I'm sure your company will understand a delay." She walked away before he could respond. Selim stared at the blank Wi-Fi login screen, a cursor blinking like a mockery of control. He closed the laptop slowly, his hands resting on the cover for a moment longer than needed. There was a heaviness to this silence, not just from being denied, but from being denied with such effortless dismissal. He looked forward, to the curtain drawn tightly across the aisle, as though it existed not just to block the view, but to wall off who was allowed to belong. From his seat, he could hear faint laughter from the front, glass clinking, cutlery scraping ceramic plates. Somewhere in that space, others were reclining in comfort, their devices connected, their meals plated. And here he was, cold sandwich crumbs on a napkin, a locked laptop, and a stale vent blowing overhead. The weight of injustice wasn't in what was taken. It was in how little anyone thought he deserved more. The man across the aisle glanced over and gave a polite nod, then quickly looked away, not wanting to get involved. Selim returned the gesture with a hollow smile, his throat dry. He didn't want confrontation. He wanted dignity. And at 30,000 feet, it was rapidly slipping further below sea level. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the aircraft rolled into takeoff position, and the hum of the engines began to swell. Selim adjusted in his cramped seat, still wedged near the lavatory, his briefcase now pushed awkwardly between his feet. He hadn't eaten more than half the dry sandwich, and the water he was served had the metallic aftertaste of the galley faucet. He had stopped checking his phone. There was no connection, no work being done, just a growing sense of tension in his chest. He tried to breathe through it, focusing on the sound of the engine instead of the laughter filtering in from first class. Somewhere behind him, Brielle whispered to another attendant. He caught only fragments, a clipped tone, a glance in his direction, and the subtle shift of energy around him. A few moments later, just as the seatbelt signs lit up, a uniformed crew member with a security badge moved briskly down the aisle and stopped at Selim's row. "Mr. Rourke?" the man asked, his tone low but firm. Selim straightened. "Yes." The man nodded slightly. "We received a note about an unidentified electronic device potentially in your possession. For precautionary reasons, I need to verify its contents before takeoff." The words didn't make sense at first. Selim frowned, confused. "I don't have anything unusual. Just my work laptop and phone." The officer gestured calmly. "We understand. Still, we'd appreciate your cooperation." Selim opened his briefcase slowly, revealing the laptop, charger, a standard USB drive, and a folder of printed documents. The officer inspected each item briefly but thoroughly, then asked Selim to power on the laptop. It booted as expected. Normal. Clean. Corporate. A spreadsheet was still open from earlier that morning. The officer nodded. "Thank you for your cooperation, sir. Apologies for the disruption." Selim watched him walk away, then turned his head slightly toward the front of the cabin, where Brielle stood, arms folded, watching. Their eyes met for only a second, but her expression didn't show relief or apology. It showed satisfaction. She had reported him. It hit him like cold water. She had fabricated a report. There had been no complaint from another passenger, no suspicious behavior. She had planted the seed, knowing it would delay him, knowing it would isolate him, knowing it would mark him. Selim sat in silence as the plane lifted into the air, his seat rattling slightly under the turbulence. The man next to him, who hadn't spoken a word since boarding, leaned subtly away from him now, as if the inspection had made him radioactive. The hum of mistrust was louder than the engines. 40 minutes later, the cabin crew began their routine announcements. The voice over the intercom was cheerful, warm, and familiar. It was Brielle. "Good evening, valued guests," she began, her tone laced with the false sweetness of customer service perfected over years. "We'd like to take a moment to recognize a few of our loyal members on today's flight. To our returning Platinum Elite guest, Mr. Charles Hollis in 2B, welcome back and thank you for flying with us again." A round of polite clapping followed from the forward cabin. Brielle continued, pausing for effect. "And a special mention to Mr. Roque, seated in our standard cabin, an economy guest who was upgraded to our premium zone today due to an internal seat adjustment. We hope you enjoy your flight, Mr. Roque." Selim froze. Mr. Roque, not Rourke, not first class, not "thank you for your loyalty," just a downgraded title, a public reframing. There was no mention of the original reservation, no acknowledgement of his actual seat. It was a broadcast of belittlement, a message disguised as a courtesy. He could hear a few light chuckles. Someone behind him whispered, "Guess someone got lucky." The person beside him shifted uncomfortably, suddenly emboldened to ask, "Did they really bump you up?" Selim didn't answer. He didn't move. He kept his eyes on the seat back in front of him, where the touchscreen now read "Welcome, guest." His name had been removed. He was invisible by design. The worst part wasn't the mistake, it was the intent. Someone like Brielle didn't stumble over names. She knew exactly what she was doing. She had stripped his identity piece by piece. His seat, his food, his access, and now his name. The humiliation wasn't a byproduct, it was the point. A tightening formed in Selim's throat, but he held it down. He wouldn't let her see it. Not here. Not now. But deep inside, something twisted. Anger suppressed, so long it became a quiet ache. This wasn't the first time he had been underestimated. But it was the first time it had been orchestrated with such precision. He glanced down at his hands, fingers curled against the armrest, knuckles pale from pressure. He released his grip slowly, like a man trying to remember that peace had a cost. The sound of laughter drifted faintly from the front of the cabin, sharp and careless, the kind that stings more because it wasn't meant to be private. Selim heard it before he saw the source. A cluster of voices just beyond the thin, dividing curtain of first class, where the Real comfort lived. Roomier seats, chilled wine, warm towels. He had tried to close his eyes for a moment, not to sleep, but to reclaim something of himself, a sliver of stillness in the chaos of quiet cruelty. But the volume grew, and then came the comment, clear and unfiltered. "Who's that guy in 7?" a male passenger asked, amusement thick in his voice. "Looks like my Uber driver from last night. He finally made it into the cabin." Another laugh followed, louder this time, and then Brielle's voice cut through it, not with correction, not with discomfort, but with delight. "Oh, don't say that," she replied, chuckling. "He's probably just trying out what it feels like to ride in the back for once." The group erupted in laughter again, and though Selim couldn't see them, he could hear their teeth, their ease, their certainty that what they said would go unchallenged. He didn't move. He didn't turn around. He sat frozen in his narrow seat, the air suddenly too cold against his skin, as if the vent above had been turned up just to match the ice spreading in his chest. His hands were on his knees, clenched tight, his jaw locked to keep from trembling. The words weren't meant for him, not directly, but they had found him anyway. They had landed, sunk in, and stayed. The attendant passing by didn't look him in the eye. The man next to him faked a cough to avoid the awkwardness. No one said anything. The plane had become a stage, and he was the unnamed extra in someone else's joke. He tried to breathe through his nose, counting the seconds, grounding himself like he'd learned to do in boardrooms filled with men who pretended not to see him until the contract required his signature. A while later, Brielle returned down the aisle, holding a small tray with water. She stopped at his row, paused, and looked at him with the same mild surprise one might give a misplaced item in the wrong aisle of a store. "You're from business class, right?" she asked, tapping her tablet. "No, wait. You're crew jump seat." Her tone was light, teasing, meant to be disarming. Selim's gaze met hers, steady but hollow. "First class," he said quietly. "Seat 1A. Reassigned for mechanical failure." Brielle blinked once, too quickly to be sincere, then gave a little laugh. "Oh, that's right. You're the one with the seat mix-up." "Sorry, it's been a long day," she said, though her eyes were sharp with something closer to mockery than fatigue. He said nothing. He took the glass of water she handed him and set it on the tray. It was lukewarm. Minutes passed, maybe more. The cabin lights dimmed further, signaling the transition into cruise mode. Screens flickered on with preloaded movies, and the murmur of entertainment buzzed softly around him. Selim didn't reach for the remote. He stared blankly at the safety card in the seat pocket, the absurdity of its bright illustrations contrasting the growing heaviness in his chest. He had built a career out of keeping composure, of weathering subtle humiliations without reacting. But something about today felt different, sharper, measured. Like every interaction was part of a silent test he didn't consent to. Brielle passed by again, this time offering coffee to the rows behind him. When she reached Selim, she paused, then tilted her head. "Can I get you anything?" "Mister," she trailed off, pretending to squint at her tablet. "Sorry, I forgot your name again." She had said it when she boarded him. She had seen it when the security officer checked it. She had repeated the wrong version of it over the speaker. She knew exactly who he was. The pretense wasn't ignorance, it was assertion. Her forgetting was deliberate. A way to remind him of his status here. Temporary, replaceable, undefined. "Rourke," he said finally. "Selim Rourke." His voice didn't shake, but it didn't carry weight either. It was factual, like reciting a password that no longer worked. Brielle smiled again, that smile that meant nothing, and moved on without writing it down. The seat was getting more uncomfortable by the hour. His back ached from the awkward angle, and the scent from the lavatory next to him seemed to grow stronger with each passing minute. It was as if the entire design of this space had conspired to press him smaller. And no matter how straight he sat, no matter how silent he stayed, it didn't seem to matter. His name was forgettable. His presence was tolerable only as the butt of a joke. His comfort was secondary. When a flight attendant different from Brielle, taller, quieter, passed by later, Selim raised a hand gently. "Do you have any pillows left?" he asked, his voice low, careful. The attendant blinked. "I believe we ran out in first class," she said automatically, then corrected herself. "I mean, you're not on the manifest for a pillow." "Sorry." She walked away before he could speak again. The plane had reached cruising altitude, but for Selim, it felt like being locked in a descending spiral. Every passing hour stripped something away: comfort, dignity, even anonymity. After the jokes, the feigned forgetfulness, and the lukewarm attempts at civility, he'd resorted to silence. A protective cocoon. He kept his posture straight, his eyes forward, his breath measured. But the pressure kept building, not from the altitude, but from the way the air around him had changed. It was heavier now, tinged with something sour, as if suspicion had become airborne. He noticed it in the way passengers looked at him, some over their screens, others under their brows. They didn't frown, didn't scowl. They simply stared a little too long, blinked a little too slowly, as though trying to decode what kind of man could generate this much unease without uttering a word. What Selim didn't know was that behind the veil of the galley curtain, Brielle had been whispering. To one passenger, she leaned in with a sympathetic shake of her head and said he was flagged at boarding. Some kind of dispute, not violent, but intense. To another, she sighed and muttered, "I'm not at liberty to share, but there was an incident during security screening." TSA almost held him back. It wasn't direct. It was suggestion, a planting of seeds in fertile soil, passengers looking for something to break their boredom, something to gossip about in hushed tones. The word flag did its job. So did incident. No one questioned it. They didn't need evidence, only a narrative. And Brielle was crafting one expertly. Selim could feel the shift, though no one had said it to his face. The man across the aisle, who had earlier nodded politely, now sat with crossed arms and angled away from him. A woman in the adjacent row clutched her handbag slightly tighter when she stood to retrieve something. The sense of invisible caution spread like static. Even the crew seemed more distant, service quieter, eyes colder. An hour later, the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're currently addressing a minor issue with our cabin pressure monitor. There will be a slight delay in beverage service as we reset the system. Thank you for your patience." It was standard routine, a hiccup in the machinery not uncommon at altitude. Most passengers responded with barely a shrug. But then Brielle reappeared, moving through the cabin with more urgency than before, her steps sharp, purposeful. She stopped near Selim's row, glanced around, then spoke just loudly enough for neighboring rows to hear. "We apologize for the delay," she announced with rehearsed professionalism. "But unfortunately, we're having to address a disturbance that occurred during boarding." Her eyes flicked quickly towards Selim, not enough to be obvious, but more than enough for the message to land. Some guests may have noticed tension earlier with a passenger who refused to comply with seat procedures. "That delay has impacted our service timeline today." She didn't name him. She didn't need to. Every glance turned to him instantly. Not with curiosity anymore, but with judgment, with blame. Selim sat frozen, caught in the spotlight of a lie he couldn't escape. His lips parted slightly, as if to speak, but no words came. What could he say? That it wasn't true? That he had done nothing? That he was the one being targeted, not the one causing trouble? In that moment, it didn't matter. The story had already been written. He was no longer a passenger. He was a problem. Someone coughed behind him and muttered, "Figures." Another passenger whispered audibly to their companion, "I knew something fell off with him when he got on." The man across the aisle leaned toward a flight attendant and asked, "Is he going to be restrained if it escalates?" The attendant, caught off guard, merely responded, "Everything is under control, sir." Selim clenched his jaw. He looked down at his hands, fingers laced tightly together on his lap, knuckles pale. The tension in his shoulders radiated pain down his spine. He wanted to scream, to stand and demand a correction, to call for the captain, to pull out his credentials, his company badge, his shareholder ID. But he didn't, because he knew how that would look. He knew that raising his voice wouldn't undo what had already taken root in their minds. It would only confirm what they now expected. The worst part wasn't the lie, it was that they wanted it to be true. It gave them something to justify the discomfort of seeing a black man in a space they still believed should be earned through heritage, not merit. A child across the aisle asked his mother in a clear voice, "Mom, is that the man who got in trouble?" The woman hushed him quickly, but her eyes were already on Selim, guarded, cold. The curtain to first class rustled slightly, and a new attendant walked out, a young man named Devin. He looked at Selim, paused, then stepped forward as if to say something, but Brielle appeared instantly behind him. She put a hand gently on his shoulder and steered him away, whispering something into his ear. Devin's eyes darted back toward Selim for a moment, then down to the floor. He didn't come back. The tension in the cabin had reached a quiet, suffocating peak. Selim could feel it settle over him like a second skin, every whisper a paper cut, every glance a needle under his collar. He had stopped shifting in his seat because movement drew attention, and attention only led to further humiliation. He had learned, in just a few short hours, how to disappear while sitting in plain sight. His laptop rested on the tray in front of him, its screen dimmed, the battery barely hanging on. He had one last document to sign, an investor agreement scheduled to close before the plane landed. It was a small task, simple in theory, but to Selim, it felt like the last thread connecting him to the world outside this nightmare. The Wi-Fi hadn't worked, of course. The seating wasn't ideal. The silence was loud. But still, he had the file ready. He just needed a few quiet minutes. Brielle appeared again, without a word, pushing a cart of beverages down the narrow aisle, her expression unreadable. As she approached Selim's row, she began preparing drinks for the passengers ahead of him, handing over cups with practiced grace and charm. When she reached him, she hesitated, her eyes flicking to the open laptop, then to the document on screen. Selim offered a tight, polite nod, nothing more. She didn't return it. Instead, she turned slightly, grabbing a small bottle of orange juice from the cart and setting it onto a tray without looking. Then, as she reached for a plastic cup, she shifted her elbow in a sudden, precise movement. The tray jolted. The bottle tipped. A splash of orange arched through the air like a warning shot before landing squarely across Selim's laptop keyboard. The machine sparked faintly. The screen flickered. Selim sucked in a breath, not loud, not sharp, just the sound of a man watching something vital slip out of his grasp. "Oh," Brielle said, voice flat with artificial surprise. "I'm so sorry." She didn't kneel to help. She didn't reach for a napkin. She simply stood, waiting for him to react. Selim reached for the laptop instinctively, tilting it forward to drain the juice. The keys were sticky, the screen dimming fast. He wiped it down with the edge of his sleeve, his breaths shorter now, his chest tightening under the pressure of restraint. Another attendant passed by. Selim raised his hand slightly. "Can I get something dry?" "Paper towels." The attendant looked startled, then nodded and disappeared into the galley. Brielle remained rooted to the spot, watching him. "It was an accident," she said coldly, before he could speak. The cart slipped. Selim didn't argue. He didn't accuse. He simply asked, voice low and even, "Do you have a replacement device? A tablet or anything I could borrow for a few minutes? I have a document I need to sign before landing." Brielle raised one eyebrow. "Replacement device?" she repeated, as if he'd asked for a diamond ring. "Sir, those are reserved for premium passengers who have been verified through our onboard business tier." Selim stared at her. "I was seated in 1A, he said. "You reassigned me. This isn't about perks. It's about necessity." Brielle folded her arms. "Policy doesn't change with reassignment. And from what I can tell, you've not been verified financially. Those devices are secured for authenticated corporate accounts." Her tone was sharp now, clinical. "I'm sorry if that's inconvenient." He looked at her for a long second, not with anger, but with the weight of everything she'd taken from him, each slight building upon the last like bricks in a wall meant to keep him out. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She had built this moment, and now waited to see how he'd crumble beneath it. The attendant returned with a handful of napkins and silently handed them to Selim. He took them, offering a quiet thank you, and began patting the keyboard, watching orange residue seep from beneath the keys. It was no use. The damage had already been done. Across the aisle, passengers watched him again, now with curiosity tinged by confirmation. The man who had caused the delay. The man who couldn't handle his own electronics. The man who had been flagged. The narrative was unfolding perfectly. Selim closed the laptop slowly, the wet keys sticking together like the remnants of his professionalism. He set it aside, wiped his palms dry, and sat back in his seat. His posture was composed. His face was still. But inside, he was crumbling in silence. He had built a company that ran across 4 states. He had overseen mergers, led teams, sat on panels about ethics and equity. But none of it had followed him into this cabin. Here he was just a misnamed inconvenience in seat 7C, who spilled things, who got flagged, who couldn't even secure a working device. Brielle moved on, rolling her cart toward the back with the same brisk efficiency she had shown all flight. No apology, no remorse, no accountability. Selim watched her retreat, his jaw tight. His dignity, soaked and sticky on a fried motherboard, sat beside him, dead. The flight continued. The sun outside had begun to lower, casting the cabin in streaks of amber and fading blue. Selim didn't look at the view. He didn't reach for the in-flight magazine. He simply stared forward, his mind replaying the incident over and over again. Not to make sense of it, but because the ache of being powerless was louder than thought. He imagined the email unsent, the deal unclosed, the impression missed. He imagined what his team would think, waiting for his signature. He imagined how many times in his life he'd been forced to overperform just to be allowed to exist in the room, and how a spilled drink could erase all of it. Selim Rourke leaned slightly to one side, away from the lavatory door that had opened and closed at least 6 times in the last 30 minutes, each time wafting an unpleasant mix of recycled air and cleaning fluid across his row. The buzz of conversation in the cabin had quieted, but he could still feel the weight of eyes on him, even when he wasn't being looked at directly. Judgments lingered in the air like turbulence, unseen, unpredictable, and completely out of his control. Somewhere behind the curtain, the staff whispered, but the occasional glance from Brielle made it clear who the topic of discussion was. Unbeknownst to him, the whispers had become something worse. Inside the staff's internal group chat, a private message thread for crew members on duty, an image had just been uploaded. It was grainy, clearly taken without consent, showing Selim from a side angle, slouched slightly, jaw clenched, tray stained with orange, laptop dark and dripping on one corner. The caption was simple, cruel, and fast-spreading. CEO energy, budget reality. Gotta love the cosplay. Another reaction followed quickly. A laughing emoji, a thumbs up, a gif of someone dramatically wiping tears of laughter. The junior attendant, Jonah, had taken the photo. He hadn't thought much of it at first. It had been Brielle's idea. Just capture the moment, she had whispered in the galley. I mean, if he's going to act like he runs the plane, we might as well make sure someone gets the shot. Jonah, young and eager to impress, complied without hesitation. When he saw how fast the crew reacted, laughing, piling on with private jokes, he felt a flash of doubt, but it passed quickly. No one told him to delete it. No one said it crossed a line. And so, it stayed, silently reinforcing the narrative they had chosen. This man, this passenger, was not someone to take seriously. Selim didn't know about the photo, but he felt the change. When Jonah passed his row again, the look on his face had shifted, from awkward sympathy to amused detachment. The look people gave when they thought they were in on something. Selim didn't speak. He had nothing left to say that anyone would listen to. But inside, the storm brewed hotter, faster. His dignity had been stripped layer by layer. His seat, his meal, his name, his access, and now his last link to the outside world. His laptop, destroyed by carelessness disguised as coincidence. He tried to close his eyes, but rest wouldn't come. His heart beat steadily, not fast, but hard, as if trying to remind him of something he was beginning to forget. His presence mattered, even if no one in this cabin acted like it. An hour passed. The captain announced descent would begin shortly. The lights flickered. People began gathering their belongings, adjusting blankets, refreshing their drinks. Selim didn't move. His bag was already beneath the seat, his tray locked in place, his body still. That's when he heard the final jab. Brielle returned one last time, her clipboard in hand, her posture stiffer than before. She stood beside him, not leaning down, not softening her voice, but addressing him with the same icy tone she'd used since boarding. "Mr. Rourke," she began, "we've received feedback from multiple guests about a pattern of confrontational behavior during the flight. Before we begin our descent, I want to make it very clear. Any further disruptions will result in immediate escalation. That includes speaking to other passengers without consent, interfering with staff duties, or attempting to access restricted areas of the cabin. Do you understand?" Selim turned his head slowly, his voice low but firm. "I haven't spoken to anyone. I haven't caused a scene. I've only asked for what I paid for." He paused. "I'd like to speak with your supervisor." His words were calm, even measured, but Brielle's face twisted slightly, as if even that request was an act of rebellion. "I'm the lead on this flight," she said sharply. "And if you continue to challenge protocol, I will be forced to alert ground security and have you escorted from the aircraft upon landing." The threat hung there, sharp and clear. Selim's stomach tightened. She wasn't just denying him dignity, now. She was framing him as a threat. All it would take was a call, a word, a glance, and the image of the disruptive passenger would be complete. He leaned back slowly, a muscle in his cheek twitching, as he suppressed the fury that clawed at the back of his throat. He nodded once, wordlessly. Brielle gave no acknowledgement, simply turning on her heel and disappearing down the aisle. As the plane began its slow descent, Selim stared out the small oval window, his reflection barely visible in the darkening sky. He could see the city lights stretching like rivers below, a glittering web of lives continuing as normal, unaware that 30,000 feet above, a man sat in silence, being erased. He thought of a document that wouldn't be signed, of the team waiting for an email that wouldn't come, of the assumptions being made about him that would never be corrected. Meanwhile, a few rows ahead in seat 2, Eli Voss, a bespectacled man in his mid-60s with silver hair and a book folded in his lap, shifted suddenly. For the past few hours, he had observed quietly, letting the flight unfold like background noise. But now, as Brielle passed by for one final cabin sweep, her voice curt as she reminded Selim again to prepare for landing, something clicked. Eli tilted his head slightly, squinting at Selim's profile. There was something familiar there. The suit, the posture, even the way the man didn't meet her eyes. It stirred a memory. He leaned toward the window, trying to catch a clearer look, and muttered to himself, "Hold on. I've seen that man before." His fingers moved quickly as he opened the photo album on his phone. He scrolled past family trips, conference panels, a blurry photo of a wine tasting event, then stopped. There it was. A photo from 6 months ago at the Skylux Airlines Gala in San Francisco. The image showed Selim Rourke standing on a stage, shaking hands with Imani Sterling, CEO of Skylux, both of them smiling beneath the banner that read, 2024 Strategic Equity Restructure Powered by People. Eli's eyes widened. Without hesitation, he turned to the man seated beside him, a younger executive in a dark suit. "Look," Eli whispered, flipping the screen toward him. "That's him. That's Selim Rourke. He was at the Skylux Gala. He gave the keynote. He's one of the lead investors behind the airline's post-pandemic recovery plan." The executive squinted at the photo, then looked back at Selim, then back at the screen. "Wait, Rourke," he repeated. "The guy from Forbes? He was on the Aviation 100 list, top 40 under 40. Eli nodded slowly, voice low but firm. "He's not just an investor. He's the reason this airline still exists." The information passed through the cabin like a fuse had been lit. Word spread quickly, whispers first, then quiet exclamations. "Are you serious?" someone murmured from across the aisle. "That's the guy from the podcast last year. He talked about restructuring airline equity systems." "He's the silent investor from Rourke Group," another passenger added, his voice laced with disbelief. "I thought he was just a board advisor. You're telling me he's on this flight?" By now, heads were turning, discreetly at first, then openly. Eyes that had previously looked at Selim with suspicion were now filled with confusion, curiosity, and a slowly dawning guilt. Someone in 4C pulled out their phone and began typing his name into a search bar. The first image that appeared was Selim on the cover of Aviation Week, arms crossed confidently in front of a private hangar. Another showed him seated beside Imani Sterling at a leadership roundtable beneath the headline, "Redefining Flight," inside the mind of the industry's quietest power broker. Up near the front, Brielle hadn't noticed the shift at first. She was busy securing the galley, giving instructions, checking on VIP passengers like Mr. Hollis in 1B. But then she felt it, the murmuring behind her. The eyes no longer focused on her, but on someone else. She turned slightly, catching a glimpse of several passengers glancing back toward row 7C with widening eyes. One even had a phone in hand, showing someone else what looked like a photo of a man in a suit on a stage. Her stomach tightened. "What's going on?" she asked the junior attendant, Jonah, as he passed. Jonah looked startled, then leaned in. "I think that guy, the one you had moved? They're saying he's one of the airline's major investors." Brielle blinked, jaw tightening. "What?" Jonah nodded. "His name's Selim Rourke. Apparently, he's like a big deal. Some people are saying he saved the company after the pandemic. There's photos. He's everywhere online." Brielle stood still for a moment, clipboard in hand, lips pressed into a thin line. She turned slowly toward the back, her eyes falling on Selim, still sitting quietly, still watching the clouds pass. Her stomach dropped. Selim sat unmoving, The same dignified stillness he had maintained since the moment this ordeal began, but this time there was a subtle shift in the air around him. He was no longer invisible, no longer a passenger relegated to mockery. He was a revelation, and now everyone knew it. Up front, Brielle's movements had changed. Gone was the swift, self-assured elegance of earlier. Her gestures were smaller now, stiffer, like someone walking through a room filled with broken glass. She had overheard enough. The whispers had risen into audible recognition. She had tried to correct Jonah when he mentioned the photo. She told him flatly, "There are a lot of black businessmen. Could be anyone." But when Jonah showed her the image, Selim shaking hands with Amani Sterling under the Skylux logo, her breath had hitched for just a second too long. The truth had already landed before the aircraft did. As the plane taxied toward the gate, the intercom buzzed. A new voice came through, not the captain's, not Brielle's. It was firmer, deeper, corporate. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated until the aircraft has come to a complete stop. A representative from Skylux Executive Office will be boarding momentarily. We appreciate your patience." Murmurs erupted immediately. A man in row 5 leaned toward the window as a black car pulled up near the jet bridge. A woman near the front adjusted her scarf and whispered, "Is that for him?" No one had to ask who. Brielle's face drained of color. Her clipboard trembled slightly in her grip. She stepped into the galley, trying to regulate her breathing. Behind her, passengers were already retrieving their phones, scrolling through search results, glancing at images, glancing at Selim, then back again, like they were replaying every moment of the flight in reverse, realizing what they had missed. When the cabin door opened, 2 individuals entered. One in a tailored navy blazer with a Skylux operations badge, the other holding a slim black tablet. They moved with purpose, eyes scanning the crew. Brielle Danton, the first one, said without raising his voice. She turned slowly, her smile strained and professional. "Yes." He handed her a printed document. "Effective immediately. You are relieved of in-flight duties pending investigation. We need your badge, your wings, and uniform ID." Gasps rose from the front row. Brielle's jaw tightened, but she complied, pulling the clipped nameplate from her blouse, slipping the ID badge from her lanyard. She hesitated at the wings, the silver Skylux pin fastened neatly over her heart. She unpinned it with trembling fingers and handed it over. "What is this about?" she asked, her voice low, defensive. The man didn't flinch. "An executive passenger was mishandled on your flight. There are multiple reports and photographic evidence. A formal statement will follow." She started to speak again, but the man turned away without waiting for it. 2 other attendants, Jonah and Devin, were also approached. Their expressions dropped as they were quietly instructed to disembark for debriefing. The third, a soft-spoken woman named Lyra, remained untouched. She glanced at Selim with wide, guilty eyes but said nothing. Passengers stood now gathering bags, but more slowly than usual. The atmosphere had flipped. Curiosity had turned to discomfort. Many were reconsidering their silence. One man in 3A muttered, "We should have said something." Another nodded. That was hard to watch. Selim rose from his seat calmly, unbothered by the stir. He retrieved his carry-on, now dry but still stained, and placed his damaged laptop into a padded sleeve. As he stepped into the aisle, a few passengers instinctively made space, as if giving way to someone important, someone powerful. Because now they knew he was. Just outside the jet bridge, another man waited. Dressed in a 3-piece suit with the Skylux crest stitched on the lapel, he stepped forward and extended his hand. "Mr. Rourke, I'm Daniel Reyes, Director of Corporate Compliance. We're deeply sorry. Ground transport is waiting for you. The CEO will be in contact within the hour. And there's something else." He handed over a sleek envelope bearing the Skylux emblem. Inside was a personal letter of apology, signed in ink by Amani Sterling herself. "I heard what happened," Reyes added quietly. "There's no excuse. The board's already seen the footage. The response will be decisive." Selim accepted the envelope without a word. His expression didn't soften, didn't harden. It remained still, composed, and perfectly unreadable. But something in his posture shifted. This time, he walked not just with dignity, but with gravity. Minutes later, while baggage rolled across the carousel, and Brielle sat in a windowless airport office, clutching her now bare uniform collar, Skylux's official channels pushed out a video across their app, website, and social media. It opened with a plain gray screen. Then, the face of CEO Imani Sterling appeared. Calm, clear, focused. Skylux Airlines was founded on the principle that luxury is not a privilege for the few. It is a promise to all. We failed that promise on Flight 227 today. Mr. Selim Rourke, an investor, a leader, and above all a passenger, was subjected to a level of disrespect that violates not only our policy, but our values. Let me be clear, no person of any background should be made to justify their right to be treated with basic human decency. We are ashamed, and we are taking action. The following days unfolded like the final act of a performance no one could forget. By the time Selim Rourke returned to his office overlooking the downtown skyline, the story of what happened aboard Flight 227 had reached beyond the aviation industry. It had become something else, an emblem of how quickly power can shift and how easily quiet prejudice can implode under the weight of truth. The apology video from CEO Imani Sterling had gone viral within hours, reshared by major outlets, reposted by influencers, and quoted by leaders across sectors. But that was only the beginning. Skylux launched an immediate internal audit, appointing an independent ethics committee to investigate patterns of misconduct within their frontline operations. Within 72 hours, the findings were damning. Brielle Danton, once considered a model of consistency among senior attendants, had a record, carefully hidden behind vague warnings and closed-door reviews. The audit uncovered 2 prior incidents, eerily similar in structure and intent. One involved an elderly black couple on a New York to London flight who had been reassigned without cause and publicly humiliated over ticketing discrepancies that were later proven false. The second case featured a South Asian entrepreneur who was removed from business class under the claim of aggressive tone, despite passenger testimonies describing him as polite and soft-spoken. Both victims had filed informal complaints, but neither case had been escalated. Until now. With renewed scrutiny, those cases were reopened, and this time they had a pattern, a motive, a name. Skylux board responded swiftly. Brielle Danton was not just terminated, she was blacklisted. An industry-wide notice was issued through the Aircrew Conduct Registry, a rarely used but powerful mechanism that barred her from applying to any FAA-certified airline. She was removed from internal databases, her staff privileges revoked, her pension frozen pending a legal review. For her, the descent had no seatbelt. The moment she received the notice, she reportedly said nothing. No press conference, no video, no statement of defense, only silence. For Selim, vindication was not a loud moment. It was a quiet reclamation. He didn't attend the press circuit, didn't speak to reporters swarming outside his building. Instead, he chose to appear 1 week later at a closed-door leadership summit hosted by Skylux, a long-scheduled gathering of investors, executives, and senior employees. The room, thick with tension and overdue respect, rose when he entered. No one needed to be told who he was anymore. He stepped onto the low stage without ceremony, adjusted the mic once, and looked out at the crowd, not with anger, but with clarity. A week ago, he began, I sat in row 7C beside a lavatory, with orange juice drying on a broken laptop, being spoken to like a problem instead of a person. He paused. The room held its breath. I didn't tell anyone who I was, because I shouldn't have had to. Respect shouldn't be conditional. It shouldn't require a resume, a title, or a media scandal. Eyes lowered. Some nodded slowly. I've spent my life building things. Companies, partnerships, ideas. But what happened on that flight reminded me of something I thought I'd outgrown, the burden of proving my place, over and over, in spaces I've already earned. He let that hang, then continued. I don't want anyone to fear me, because I hold shares. I want them to see me and others like me as human beings, deserving of dignity no matter what seat we're in. The applause didn't come right away. It came after the silence settled, like rain after thunder. Long, sustained, unanimous. In the days that followed, Skylux instituted sweeping policy changes, mandatory bias and empathy training for all staff, new escalation protocols to prevent gate-level discrimination, and a passenger advocacy office reporting directly to the board. Selim declined a seat on the oversight committee, not out of disinterest, but because he believed the system should never rely on any one person to protect fairness. If the system only works when someone powerful is watching, he told Amani Sterling in a private follow-up meeting, then it's not a system. It's theater. As the news cycle moved forward, so did he. Quietly, gracefully, he returned to his business, to the deals, to the mentors he still spoke with weekly, and to the young professionals he coached each month. But something had changed. Not in him, but around him. When people saw him now, they didn't just see a founder or investor. They saw a man who had sat in silence, endured injustice, and still walked off that plane with his head high. He never once mentioned Brielle by name. Not in public, not in private. When asked later by a fellow board member if he wanted to press charges, Selim shook his head. What would that fix, he asked. My goal was never revenge. It was truth. And so, the story closed, not with handcuffs or headlines, but with a simple truth returned to its rightful place. That human worth cannot be measured by seat assignment, skin tone, or silence in the face of cruelty. It must be honored from the start. The end. If this story moved you even a little, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a powerful moment like this again. Which part hit you the hardest? Was it the spilled drink? The public shaming? Or the moment everyone realized who Selim really was? And where in the world are you watching from? Tell us your city or country in the comments. We love seeing how far these stories reach. Let us know your thoughts. We read every single comment.